when my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "Pauline, you're just too sick to be around the children this Christmas." I felt something inside me break. What she didn't know was that by New Year's Eve, I'd make sure she was the one who felt truly sick about losing everything she thought she owned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Pauline Butler, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I'm 72 years old, a retired nurse who spent 40 years taking care of other people's loved ones, and I never imagined I'd find myself fighting for a place at my own family's table. But that's exactly where this story begins, in the pristine living room of the house I helped my son Marcus buy, listening to his wife Elena explain why I wasn't welcome for Christmas dinner. The morning it all started, I was sitting in my small apartment above their garage, the one Marcus had insisted I move into after I'd been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome 2 years earlier. He'd been so concerned, so loving, telling me that this way I'd never be alone if I needed help. Elena had smiled and nodded, saying how wonderful it would be to have Grandma so close to little Sophie and baby James. Back then, her smile had seemed genuine. Now I realize it was the kind of smile you give someone when you're already planning their exit. I was having what my doctor called a flare-up that week. My joints ached more than usual, and I'd been spending most of my time in bed, trying to conserve energy for the holidays. I'd been looking forward to Christmas morning for months, imagining Sophie's face when she opened the dollhouse I'd been secretly working on since August, despite my trembling hands making the tiny furniture so difficult to craft. I'd pushed through the pain to wrap James's gifts, the soft blankets I'd knitted during my better days when my fingers cooperated. Elena appeared at my door that Tuesday morning without knocking, as had become her habit. She was dressed in her usual uniform of expensive athleisure wear, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail that probably cost more to maintain than most people's monthly grocery budgets. She carried a steaming mug of coffee and wore an expression I'd learned to recognize as her preparing to be reasonable face. "Pauline," she said, settling into the chair across from my bed without being invited, "we need to talk about Christmas." I struggled to sit up straighter, pulling my worn robe closed. The apartment was small but clean, decorated with photos of Marcus growing up and the grandchildren I adored. Elena's eyes swept over my things with barely concealed distaste, lingering on the medications lined up on my nightstand and the heating pad draped over the back of my chair. "I've been thinking about what's best for everyone," she continued, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they want you to accept gracefully. "You've been having such a hard time lately with your condition, and Christmas can be so overwhelming. All that noise and excitement, people coming and going. I really think it would be better if you rested this year." The words hit me like cold water. I blinked, certain I'd misunderstood. "You mean you want me to skip Christmas morning? With Sophie and James?" Elena's smile became even more patient. "I mean, it would be healthier for you to stay here where it's quiet. You can see the children later, when you're feeling stronger. Maybe after New Year's, when things calm down." I felt my chest tighten, but not from my illness this time. This was pure hurt, sharp and clean. "Elena, I've never missed a Christmas with Marcus. Never. Even when I was working double shifts at the hospital, even the year I had pneumonia." "That's exactly my point," she said, leaning forward like she was explaining something to a child. "You've always pushed yourself too hard. Look where it's gotten you. You're exhausted all the time. You can barely make it up the stairs some days. Chronic fatigue is serious, Pauline. You need to start taking it seriously." The way she said chronic fatigue made it sound like a character flaw, rather than a medical condition. I dealt with enough skeptical doctors and dismissive family members over the years to recognize the tone. She thought I was exaggerating, maybe even faking it for attention. "I can manage one day," I said quietly. "It's Christmas." Elena stood up abruptly, her coffee mug clutched in both hands like a shield. "It's not just about managing, though, is it? Sophie asked me yesterday why Grandma Pauline is always sad now. She's only 6, Pauline. She doesn't understand why you can't play with her like you used to. And James gets fussy when he's around too much commotion. The doctor said we need to keep his environment calm and predictable. Each word felt like a small knife. Sophie had indeed stopped climbing into my lap the way she used to, but I'd assumed it was because she was getting older, more interested in her tablet and her friends. The idea that she saw me as sad, as someone to avoid, made my throat close up. I could stay in the corner, I heard myself saying, and immediately hated how pathetic I sounded. I wouldn't get in the way. I just want to watch them open their presents. Elena's expression softened, but not in a kind way. It was the look healthcare workers get when they're dealing with a particularly difficult patient who won't accept reality. "Oh, Pauline, you don't see it, do you? You're not just quiet in the corner anymore. You're the center of attention, but not in a good way. Everyone tiptoeing around, wondering if you're okay, if you need something, if the noise is too much. It changes the whole dynamic." I stared at her, trying to process what she was really saying. That my presence was a burden. That my family would be happier, more relaxed, without me there. "Marcus doesn't feel this way," I said, though even as the words came out, I wasn't entirely sure they were true. When was the last time my son had spent more than 5 minutes in my apartment? When had he last called just to check on me, rather than asking Elena to do it? Elena's smile became genuinely warm for the first time in the conversation, but it wasn't warmth directed at me. "Marcus is worried about you constantly. He tosses and turns at night, wondering if we're doing enough, if you're getting the care you need. He feels guilty about your condition, like somehow he should be able to fix it. Giving him permission to just enjoy Christmas with his children, without having to manage your needs too, would be a gift." The manipulation was so smooth I almost admired it. She'd made my exclusion sound like generosity, like I'd be selfish not to agree. She'd positioned herself as the reasonable one, the one thinking of everyone's well-being, while I was the sick old woman clinging to traditions that no longer served anyone. "I see," I said slowly. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, distant and hollow. Elena brightened, mistaking my tone for acceptance. "I knew you'd understand. You're always so thoughtful about what's best for the family. We can do a little celebration later, just the 4 of us. Maybe New Year's Day, when you're feeling more up to it." She stood to leave, pausing at the door with her hand on the knob. "Oh, and Pauline? I know you've been working on some gifts for the children. Why don't you hold on to those for now? We're trying to teach Sophie about gratitude and not being overwhelmed by too many presents. It might be better to space things out." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone with the weight of what had just happened. She didn't want me at Christmas, and she didn't want my gifts either. I was being erased from my own family's holiday as efficiently as if I'd never existed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dollhouse in the corner that had taken me months to complete. My hands had cramped for hours after each crafting session, but I'd pushed through because I could imagine Sophie's face lighting up. Now it felt like evidence of my own foolishness, my inability to recognize when I wasn't wanted. The worst part was the doubt creeping in around the edges of my hurt. Was Elena right? Had I been so focused on my own needs that I'd missed how my presence affected everyone else? Was my love for my grandchildren actually selfish? A burden they were too polite to reject directly? I thought about the last few family dinners I'd attended. Marcus had seemed distracted, checking his phone frequently. Elena had hovered, asking repeatedly if I needed anything, if the chair was comfortable, if the room was too warm or too cold. Sophie had been quieter than usual, staying close to her mother instead of chattering to me the way she used to.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
At the time, I'd attributed it to normal family dynamics, but now I wondered if I'd been willfully blind. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was step back, give them space to be a family without the complication of my illness and needs. The thought made me feel hollow inside, but it also carried a strange relief. No more wondering if I was welcome. No more exhausting myself trying to keep up with activities that left me bedridden for days afterward. I reached for my phone to call Marcus, to tell him I understood and that he shouldn't worry about me. But when I pulled up his contact, I found myself hesitating. Something about the conversation with Elena bothered me beyond the obvious hurt. There had been something too polished about her arguments, too prepared. Like she'd been planning this conversation for a while, anticipating my objections and crafting responses designed to shut them down. And there was something else, something that nagged at me as I replayed her words. The way she'd mentioned the children's routines and needs, the doctor's advice about keeping James's environment calm. In all my years as a nurse, I'd never heard a pediatrician recommend isolating a baby from loving family members unless there were serious health concerns. James was a healthy, happy 8-month-old who'd always seemed to enjoy my attention. I set the phone down without making the call. Instead, I pulled my laptop onto my bed and opened my email. If I was going to be excluded from Christmas, I wanted to understand exactly why, and I wanted to hear it from Marcus himself. The email I sent was simple and direct. I told him that Elena had explained about Christmas, that I understood their concerns about my health and the children's needs. I said I wanted what was best for everyone, but that I'd appreciate hearing from him directly about how he felt, since this was such a big change from our family traditions. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then closed the laptop and tried to nap. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling back to Elena's words, to the casual way she'd dismissed 40 years of Christmas mornings with my son, as if they were nothing more than an inconvenient habit that had outlived its usefulness. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom, got your email. Can we talk tonight after the kids are in bed? I'll come up around 8. The message felt ominous. If he'd wanted to reassure me, to tell me that Elena had misunderstood or overstepped, he would have called immediately. The fact that he needed time to prepare suggested the conversation would be difficult. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange state of suspended animation. I couldn't focus on reading or watching television. I kept finding myself staring out the window at the main house, watching Elena move through the brightly lit rooms with Sophie and James. From a distance, they looked like a perfect family unit, complete and self-contained. There was no obvious space where I fit into that picture. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs leading to my apartment. He knocked softly before using his key, something he'd started doing recently that I'd initially appreciated as respectful but now wondered if it was another sign of growing distance. "Hey, Mom," he said, settling into the same chair Elena had occupied that morning. My son looked tired, older than his 34 years. His dark hair, so much like his father's had been, was thinning at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He worked long hours as an engineering consultant, and I knew Elena's part-time marketing job meant he carried most of the financial pressure for their lifestyle. "Thank you for coming up," I said. "I wanted to hear from you about Christmas." Marcus rubbed his forehead, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with a difficult homework problem. "Elena told me about your conversation today. I want you to know it wasn't easy for her to bring it up. She's been worried about how to handle this for weeks." The fact that they'd been discussing my exclusion for weeks without including me in the conversation stung, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Handle what exactly?" "Your health, Mom. The way it's affecting everyone, including you. Elena thinks, and I have to agree, that you've been pushing yourself too hard trying to keep up with family activities. Last month, after Sophie's birthday party, you were in bed for 3 days. After Thanksgiving, you canceled your doctor's appointment because you were too exhausted to drive. Both things were true, but hearing them recited like evidence in a case against me made them sound worse than they'd felt at the time. Yes, I'd been tired after the birthday party, but I'd also been happy. Yes, I'd rescheduled my appointment, but it hadn't been urgent. I'm managing my condition the best I can," I said. "Some days are harder than others, but I don't want to miss out on important moments because of it." Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest and concerned. "But that's exactly the problem, Mom. You're not managing it, you're fighting it, and the fight is wearing you out." Elena showed me some articles about chronic fatigue syndrome, about how important it is to pace yourself, to avoid boom and bust cycles. I'd read the same articles, probably before Elena had ever heard of chronic fatigue syndrome. The advice about pacing was sound, but it was also written by people who didn't understand what it meant to choose between being present for your family and preserving your energy. Elena had never had to make those calculations. What does this have to do with Christmas specifically? I asked. Marcus sighed. Christmas is the biggest event of the year for us. Extended family coming over, the kids excited and running around, cooking and cleaning and wrapping presents. Elena's parents are flying in from Portland. Her sister's family is driving down from Sacramento. It's going to be chaos from morning until night. This was the first I'd heard about Elena's family coming for Christmas. Usually we alternated years, spending one Christmas with her family and the next with just us. The fact that they'd planned a large gathering without mentioning it to me suggested the decision to exclude me had been made long before Elena's conversation with me that morning. I didn't know you were having such a big celebration, I said carefully. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. Elena wanted to surprise everyone. Her parents haven't seen the kids since last spring, and her sister just had a baby. It seemed like a good opportunity to bring everyone together. Everyone except me. The words hung in the air between us. Marcus stared at his hands, and I could see him struggling to find a way to make this sound reasonable, kind even. Mom, you know it's not about not wanting you there. It's about what's realistic. Elena's going to be cooking for 12 people, managing the kids, trying to be a good hostess. She can't also be constantly checking on you, making sure you're not overwhelmed. And you know how you get in social situations lately. You get anxious when there are too many people, too much noise. I wanted to argue, but there was truth in what he said. Large gatherings had become more difficult for me since my diagnosis. Not because I didn't enjoy them, but because the energy required to participate fully often left me depleted for days afterward. I'd learned to find quiet corners, to step outside when the noise became too much, to excuse myself for short rests. Apparently, these coping strategies had been noticed and interpreted as problems rather than solutions. I could stay for just the morning, I offered. Just to watch the children open their presents, then go back upstairs to rest. Marcus's expression grew pained. That's what Elena was worried about. That you'd try to compromise your health just to be included. She thinks, and honestly I'm starting to agree, that the best thing for everyone is if you focus on getting better. Take Christmas off, use the quiet time to rest, maybe start the new year feeling stronger. The phrase "take Christmas off" made it sound like a vacation, a choice I was making for my own benefit rather than an exclusion imposed by others. I wondered if Marcus truly believed this framing, or if he'd simply adopted Elena's language to make himself feel better about the decision. And what about the children? What do I tell Sophie when she asks why Grandma isn't there for Christmas? Elena's already talked to her. She explained that sometimes grandparents need special rest time, and that we want to make sure you're healthy for lots of Christmases to come. Sophie understood. The idea that my 6-year-old granddaughter had been prepared for my absence, coached on how to accept it without question, felt like another small betrayal. Sophie had always been perceptive, sensitive to adult emotions, in a way that sometimes surprised me. If Elena had convinced her that my absence was normal and necessary, then my granddaughter was learning to expect less from our relationship. What about after Christmas? I asked. Do I get to see them then, or is this the beginning of a bigger separation? Marcus looked genuinely startled by the question. Of course you'll see them. This isn't about cutting you out of our lives, Mom. It's about finding a sustainable way for you to be part of the family without exhausting yourself. But I wasn't sure I believed him. Once a boundary is established, it becomes easier to maintain it, to expand it. If I was too sick for Christmas, when would I be well enough? If family gatherings were too overwhelming, what other events would be deemed unsuitable for my participation? I need to think about this, I said finally. It's a lot to process. Marcus stood up, relief evident on his face. He delivered the difficult message, and I hadn't fought him on it, which was probably the best outcome he'd hoped for. Take all the time you need. And Mom, this doesn't change how much we love you. We just want what's best for your health. After he left, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, I could see the warm glow from the main house, hear the faint sounds of family life continuing without me. Elena was probably putting James to bed while Marcus helped Sophie with her bath. Normal evening routines that I'd once been occasionally invited to share but was now apparently too sick to witness. The loneliness was crushing. But underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. For months I'd been questioning myself, wondering if my fatigue was real or exaggerated, if my need for rest was legitimate or lazy. Elena's ultimatum, cruel as it was, had at least provided clarity. I wasn't imagining the distance that had grown between us. I wasn't being oversensitive about the subtle exclusions and dismissals. But clarity didn't make the situation hurt less. If anything, it made it worse, because now I had to decide what to do with the truth I'd been given. I could accept their assessment of me as too sick, too burdensome, too much trouble to include. I could retreat further into my apartment, make myself smaller and quieter until I disappeared entirely from their lives. Or I could find another way forward, one that didn't require me to accept their diminished version of who I was and what I was worth. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been my physician for 15 years, through my husband's death, my retirement, and my diagnosis. She knew me as more than just a collection of symptoms and limitations. Dr. Chen? I said when she answered her personal line, something she'd told me to use in emergencies. I'm sorry to call so late. I need to ask you something important about my condition and what I'm actually capable of. Pauline, of course. What's going on? I told her about the conversation with Elena and Marcus, about being told I was too sick for Christmas, too much of a burden for family gatherings. I tried to present their concerns fairly, to acknowledge the legitimacy of their worries about my health. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, making small sounds of understanding and sympathy. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Pauline, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you feel that your current symptoms and limitations make it genuinely dangerous or inadvisable for you to spend a few hours with your family on Christmas morning? I thought about it seriously, trying to separate my hurt feelings from my medical reality. No, I said. It might tire me out, and I'd probably need to rest the next day. But dangerous? No. That's what I thought. Your chronic fatigue is real and it requires management, but it doesn't make you fragile or incompetent. It sounds to me like your family has developed some misconceptions about your condition, possibly influenced by their own anxiety about caregiving responsibilities. Her words were professional but kind, and they illuminated something I'd been struggling to articulate. Elena and Marcus weren't necessarily being malicious, but they were using my illness as an excuse to simplify their own lives, to avoid the minor accommodations and considerations that including me would require. What should I do? I asked. What do you want to do? The question surprised me. For months I'd been so focused on what others wanted from me, what they thought I was capable of, what would make them comfortable, that I'd stopped considering my own desires. I want to spend Christmas morning with my grandchildren, I said without hesitation. I want to see Sophie's face when she opens the dollhouse I made for her. I want to hold James while he plays with the wrapping paper. I want to be part of my family. Then you should be, Dr. Chen said simply. Your health condition doesn't disqualify you from participating in your own life, Pauline. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or has other motivations. After we hung up, I felt something shift inside me, like a muscle that had been tense for months finally relaxing. Dr. Chen was right. I'd been allowing Elena and Marcus to define the limits of my life based on their comfort level rather than my actual capabilities. But knowing I was right to feel hurt and excluded didn't solve the immediate problem. Christmas was still 10 days away, and I was still unwelcome at my own family's celebration. I could show up anyway, force a confrontation that would make everyone uncomfortable and possibly damage my relationship with my son permanently. Or I could find another way to make my point, one that would be harder for them to dismiss or argue with. I opened my laptop again and began typing a different kind of email, this one to my lawyer, Martin Rodriguez. Martin had handled my husband's estate and the legal arrangements around my move to Marcus's property. He was also the only person besides my banker who knew the full extent of my financial resources, assets I'd kept private for reasons that were about to become very relevant. The email was brief. I told Martin the first needed to schedule an appointment as soon as possible to discuss some changes to my living situation and to review the terms of certain financial arrangements I'd made with my son. I mentioned that the situation was time-sensitive and asked if he could see me before Christmas, His response came within an hour, which didn't surprise me. Martin billed at nearly $400 an hour, and I'd been a very good client over the years. He could see me Thursday morning, and he'd pull my files in preparation for our meeting. I closed the laptop feeling more purposeful than I had in months. Elena thought she could exclude me from Christmas because I was too sick, too much trouble, too dependent on their charity to object. She'd made calculations about my worth to the family that didn't account for all the variables in the equation. But there were things about my situation that Elena didn't know. Financial realities that might change her assessment of whether my presence was worth accommodating. I'd spent my entire adult life being generous with my resources, helping when help was needed, supporting my family without expectation of credit or recognition. Maybe it was time for that generosity to become more visible, more explicitly connected to my treatment and inclusion in family decisions. Maybe Elena needed to understand that the sick old woman she was so eager to set aside had been supporting their comfortable lifestyle in ways she'd never bothered to acknowledge or appreciate. I thought about my husband Tom, who died 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. He'd been a practical man, a retired accountant who'd managed our investments conservatively and successfully. Before his death, he'd made me promise to use our money to secure my own comfort and dignity, not to give it all away to children who might take my generosity for granted. "Don't let them think you need them more than they need you," he'd said during one of our last serious conversations. "Family love should be unconditional, but respect has to be earned both ways." At the time, I'd thought his concern was unnecessary. Marcus had always been a loving son, and Elena, despite her perfectionist tendencies, had seemed genuinely welcoming when I moved into their property. But Tom had understood something about family dynamics that I was only beginning to grasp. He'd seen how easily the balance of power could shift, how quickly gratitude could turn into resentment, especially when money was involved. I'd been supporting Marcus and Elena financially for years, in ways they probably didn't even think about anymore. The down payment for their house, which had technically been a loan but had never been repaid. The investment account I'd established for the children's education, adding money every month without fanfare or recognition. The trust fund I'd set up as a safety net for all of them, the existence of which I'd never mentioned because I hadn't wanted them to feel dependent or obligated. Elena thought I was a burden, a sick old woman whose presence complicated their perfect family dynamic. She'd miscalculated badly, and it was time for me to help her understand just how badly. Thursday morning couldn't come fast enough. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of December drizzle that made everything look washed out and tired. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Martin Rodriguez, choosing my best navy blazer and the pearl earrings Tom had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like a woman who had her affairs in order, not someone whose family considered too frail to handle a holiday dinner. The law offices of Rodriguez and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and chrome with a view of the mountains that probably cost extra. Martin's assistant, a polished young woman named Jennifer, greeted me with professional warmth and offered coffee while I waited. I accepted, grateful for something to do with my hands while I organized my thoughts. Martin emerged from his office 5 minutes later, a compact man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted about success. He'd handled Tom's affairs with discretion and competence, never making me feel like a burden or treating my questions as foolish. Today, his expression carried a mixture of professional curiosity and personal concern. "Pauline, good to see you," he said, guiding me into his corner office. "Though I have to admit, your email had me wondering what's going on. Are you having problems with the living arrangement?" I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting how the familiar ritual of legal consultation made me feel more grounded, more like myself. "You could say that. I need to understand exactly what leverage I have in my current situation, and I need to know what options are available to me if I decide to make some changes." Martin opened the thick file he'd prepared, pages of documents chronicling years of financial decisions and legal arrangements. "Let's start with the basics. You own the apartment above Marcus and Elena's garage outright, correct? That was structured as a separate deed when you financed their home purchase." "That's right. I wanted to maintain some independence while helping them get established." The decision had seemed wise at the time, a way to be generous without giving up all control. Now I was grateful for Tom's insistence that we structure it as two separate properties, rather than simply moving in as a dependent relative. Martin flipped through several pages, making notes on a yellow pad. And the original loan you provided for their down payment was $65,000, with agreed-upon monthly payments of $400 over 15 years. How many payments have you actually received? I dreaded this question because I knew the answer would sound foolish. None. Marcus has been struggling with cash flow since Elena reduced her work hours after James was born. I told him we could defer the payments until he was more established. That was 2 years ago? Yes. Martin made another note, his expression carefully neutral. So they currently owe you approximately $75,000 in principal and deferred interest. Are you aware that the deferment was supposed to be formalized with an amended payment schedule? I wasn't aware of that, and the knowledge made my stomach clench. Another oversight. Another example of my trying to be accommodating without protecting my own interests. What does that mean exactly? It means that legally the full amount became due when they missed the first payment, but you've been accepting the situation informally. It also means you have the right to call in the entire debt with 30 days' notice, or to begin foreclosure proceedings if they can't pay. The word foreclosure hung in the air like smoke. I'd never imagined myself as the kind of person who would foreclose on her own son's home, but apparently I'd structured my generosity in ways that gave me exactly that power. There's more, Martin continued, turning to another section of the file. The education trust you established for Sophie and James currently has a balance of just over $120,000. As the sole trustee, you have complete discretion over distributions and can modify the terms at any time. I'd been contributing $500 monthly to that trust since Sophie was born, increasing it to $800 when James arrived. Elena knew the trust existed, but had never asked about the balance or the terms. She'd simply accepted it as another example of my generosity, never considering that generosity could be conditional. And then there's the matter of the larger trust, Martin said, his voice taking on a different quality. The one Tom insisted you establish before his death. This was the big secret, the financial reality that even Marcus didn't fully understand. After Tom's death, I'd inherited not just his life insurance and pension, but a portfolio of investments he'd been quietly building for decades. Conservative but consistent growth over 40 years had created wealth that far exceeded what anyone expected a retired nurse and accountant to possess. The current balance is approximately $2.8 million, Martin said quietly. With you as the primary beneficiary during your lifetime, and Marcus and the children as secondary beneficiaries upon your death. But as you know, you have complete control over distributions and can modify the beneficiaries at your discretion. $2.8 million. Even hearing it said aloud still felt surreal. Tom had been methodical about money in the same way he'd been methodical about everything else. Investing small amounts consistently, reinvesting dividends, never touching the principal, except to rebalance the portfolio. He'd shown me the projections before his death, but seeing the reality still felt like play money, numbers too large to represent anything real. Marcus knows about the trust but not the current balance? Martin asked. He knows it exists. I told him there would be something for him and the children eventually, but I've never discussed specifics. I wanted him to build his own life without depending on inheritance. Martin nodded approvingly. Very wise. And Elena? Elena knows there's a trust, but she assumes it's modest. Maybe enough for a down payment on a house someday, or college tuition. She's never asked for details. Also wise, given the current situation. Now, tell me what's actually happening that brought you here today. I explained about Christmas, about Elena's declaration that I was too sick to participate, about Marcus's apparent agreement with her assessment. I told him about the extended family gathering I'd been excluded from, about the careful way they'd framed my absence as being for my own good. Martin listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. Pauline, I need to ask you something directly. Are you actually too sick to handle a family Christmas? Or are they using your health condition as an excuse to exclude you for their own convenience? The question was so direct it took my breath away. I'm not too sick, I said firmly. I have good days and bad days, but Christmas morning wouldn't be dangerous for me. Tiring, maybe, but not dangerous. That's what I thought. I've been your lawyer for 5 years, and I've never seen you unable to handle your own affairs or make sound decisions. If anything, you've been more generous and accommodating than most people in your position would be. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more focused. Here's what I think is happening. Elena has gotten comfortable with your financial support and your minimal involvement in major decisions. She likes having your resources available without having to navigate your opinions or preferences. Your illness has given her a socially acceptable reason to limit your participation in family life while continuing to benefit from your generosity. The analysis was harsh, but felt accurate. Elena had indeed grown more dismissive over the past year, more likely to make decisions about household matters that affected me without consultation. She'd rearranged the garage storage without asking, making it harder for me to access my car. She'd changed the wireless password and never thought to give me the new one. Small things individually, but together they painted a picture of someone who saw me as a dependent rather than an equal partner in the household. What are my options? I asked. Martin consulted his notes again. You have several, and they range from gentle correction to nuclear option. On the mild end, you could simply show up for Christmas and force them to either include you or explicitly reject you in front of extended family. That would make their behavior more visible and harder to justify. And on the other end, you could call in the loan, force them to refinance, or sell the house to pay you back. You could restructure the trust to exclude Elena entirely, making Marcus the sole beneficiary but with conditions about your treatment. You could move out of the apartment and rent it to strangers, giving them a tenant they'd have to accommodate, instead of a family member they can dismiss. Each option felt both empowering and terrifying. I'd spent so many years being the accommodating one, the peacemaker, that the idea of using my financial leverage aggressively felt foreign. There's also a middle path, Martin continued. You could make Elena aware of the full extent of your financial involvement in their lives, make it clear that your generosity has been a choice rather than an obligation, and that continued support depends on being treated with appropriate respect. How would I do that? Martin smiled for the first time since our conversation began. Very carefully and with complete deniability if you change your mind later. The beauty of having real financial power is that you don't have to threaten people explicitly. You just have to help them understand the reality of their situation. We spent the next hour crafting a strategy that felt both assertive and reversible. Martin would prepare documents that outlined my current financial contributions to their household, including the deferred loan payments, the monthly trust contributions, and a conservative estimate of what my apartment would rent for on the open market. He would also prepare a letter explaining my right to call in the loan and my discretion over trust distributions, presented as a routine annual review rather than a threat. The goal, Martin explained, is to give them complete information about their financial relationship with you, presented in a neutral, businesslike way. How they respond to that information will tell you a lot about their priorities and their respect for you as a person. I left the meeting feeling lighter than I had in weeks, but also slightly dizzy from the magnitude of what I was contemplating. For years I'd been the grateful dependent, thankful for Marcus and Elena's willingness to let me live near them, careful not to be too much trouble or ask for too much consideration. The revelation that I was actually the financial foundation of their comfortable lifestyle changed everything. But having power and using it were different things, and I wasn't sure yet how far I was willing to go to defend my place in the family. The nuclear options Martin had outlined would certainly get Elena's attention, but they might also damage my relationship with Marcus and the children permanently. I needed to think carefully about what I actually wanted to achieve and what I was willing to risk to get it. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods decorated for Christmas. Houses glowed with warm light, windows revealing glimpses of families preparing for the holiday. I thought about all the Christmases I'd shared with Marcus over the years, from his excitement as a toddler to his teenage years when he'd pretended not to care about presents anymore. Those memories belonged to both of us, and Elena didn't have the right to simply erase them, because my presence had become inconvenient. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Elena's car was gone, probably picking up Sophie from school. The main house looked quiet, and I was grateful for the chance to process my conversation with Martin without having to maintain a facade of normalcy. Inside my apartment, I made tea and sat at my small table with the documents Martin had given me to review. Seeing my financial relationship with Marcus and Elena laid out in black and white was sobering. Over the past 3 years, I'd contributed nearly $200,000 to their household in various forms, not counting the deferred loan payments. Elena's part-time marketing job brought in maybe $20,000 a year, and while Marcus earned a good salary, the mortgage payments on their house would be difficult to manage without my contributions. I was not the dependent they'd positioned me as, either in their own minds or in conversations with extended family. I was a significant financial partner who'd been treated as if my contributions were so small they could be taken for granted. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophie, sent from Elena's phone. "Grandma Pauline? Can I come see you when we get home? I want to show you my art project." The message made my chest tight with love and frustration. Sophie still wanted to spend time with me. Still thought of me as someone worth sharing her excitement with. Elena was the one creating distance, using my health as an excuse to limit our relationship. I texted back that I'd love to see her project and asked her to come up whenever she got home. If Elena had a problem with that, she could explain to her daughter why Grandma was suddenly off limits. 20 minutes later, I heard Sophie's feet on the stairs, taking them 2 at a time in the way that always made me hold my breath. She burst through my door carrying a construction paper Christmas tree covered in glitter and cotton ball snow. "Look what I made at school," she announced, holding it up for my inspection. Mrs. Patterson said it was the most creative one in the whole class. "Sophie, it's beautiful," I said, and meant it. The tree was lopsided, and the glitter was applied with the enthusiasm that left more on the floor than on the paper, but it radiated the kind of joy that only children could create. "Tell me about how you made it." She climbed into the chair next to mine and launched into a detailed explanation of the construction process, complete with dramatic reenactments of particularly challenging glitter application techniques. Listening to her chatter, watching her animated gestures, I felt the familiar warmth that came from being someone's favorite audience. "Grandma Pauline," she said suddenly, her voice becoming more serious. "Mommy said you might not be able to come for Christmas because you're too tired. Are you really too tired?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. Sophie's brown eyes, so much like Marcus's, were fixed on my face with the intensity that children brought to important conversations. She was asking me to tell her the truth, not to give her the sanitized version Elena had prepared. "I get tired sometimes," I said carefully. "But I'm not too tired to spend Christmas morning with you and James. I've been looking forward to it for months." Sophie's face brightened. "I knew it! I told Mommy you wouldn't want to miss Christmas. But she said sick people need to rest more." "Did she explain why she thought I was too sick to come?" Sophie scrunched up her nose, thinking. "She said you get overwhelmed when there are lots of people, and that it wouldn't be fair to make you be around all the noise and excitement. But Grandma Pauline, you like noise and excitement. Remember when we had that dance party last month and you did the funny robot dance?" I did remember. It had been one of my better days, and Sophie had been playing music on her iPad, showing me moves she'd learned in her dance class. I'd joined in, making exaggerated robot movements that had sent her into fits of giggles. We'd danced for 20 minutes before I'd needed to sit down, but it had been 20 minutes of pure joy. Elena had found us that way, sweaty and laughing, and her expression had been strange, not disapproving exactly, but something like concern mixed with irritation. At the time, I'd assumed she was worried I was overexerting myself. Now I wondered if she'd seen our connection as a threat to her control over family dynamics. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions they think are best, even when other people don't agree, I said diplomatically. Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone much older than 6. "But it's your family too, right? Shouldn't you get to decide if you want to come?" Out of the mouths of babes. My granddaughter had identified the core issue with startling clarity. It was my family too, and I should get to decide how much participation I could handle, not have that decision made for me by people who might have other motivations. "You're very smart, Sophie. I said, pulling her into a hug. And yes, I think I should get to decide. We spent another hour working on a puzzle together, Sophie chattering about school and friends and the presents she hoped to find under the Christmas tree. She didn't mention her mother's family coming for the holiday, which suggested Elena hadn't shared those plans with her yet. The omission felt significant, another piece of evidence that the exclusion had been planned carefully rather than arising naturally from concerns about my health. When Elena called from downstairs for Sophie to come help with dinner, my granddaughter hugged me extra tight. I hope you can come for Christmas, Grandma Pauline. It won't be the same without you. After she left, I sat in the growing darkness, thinking about Martin's advice and Sophie's unconscious wisdom. Elena had made a calculation about my worth to the family that didn't account for all the variables. She'd assumed I would accept exclusion gracefully, that my gratitude for being allowed to live in their orbit would outweigh my desire to be treated as an equal family member. She'd also assumed that my financial contributions were so established, so automatic, that they didn't need to be acknowledged or appreciated. In her mind, I was probably a dependent who should be grateful for their tolerance, not a benefactor who deserved consideration and respect. It was time to correct those misconceptions, but I wanted to do it strategically. Martin's documents would arrive by courier tomorrow, giving Elena the weekend to process the information before Christmas. If she was the reasonable person she claimed to be, she'd recognize that excluding someone who'd been so generous was poor judgment and poor manners. If she wasn't reasonable, well, then I'd have learned something important about her character and could adjust my future decisions accordingly. I made myself a simple dinner and tried to read, but my mind kept circling back to the conversation with Sophie. My granddaughter expected me to be at Christmas, wanted me there, couldn't understand why I wouldn't be included. From her perspective, the adult explanations about my health didn't make sense, because she'd seen me on good days, knew I was capable of joy and participation when given the chance. Elena was teaching Sophie to have lower expectations of our relationship, to accept my absence as normal and necessary. That was perhaps the most damaging part of this whole situation. Not just that I was being excluded, but that my exclusion was being normalized for the children, presented as the natural consequence of aging and illness, rather than a choice made by adults who found my presence inconvenient. I couldn't let that lesson stand unchallenged. Around 9 o'clock, I heard Marcus come home from work, his car door slamming in the driveway below. A few minutes later, I could hear voices from the main house, Elena's higher pitch mixing with his deeper tones. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm suggested they were discussing logistics, probably coordinating schedules and meal planning for the holiday. It struck me that in all their planning and all their discussions about what would be best for everyone, they'd never actually asked me what I wanted. They'd made assumptions about my capabilities and preferences without consulting me, then presented their conclusions as medical necessity rather than personal choice. That pattern wasn't limited to Christmas. Over the past year, Elena had made several decisions that affected my daily life without asking for my input. She'd hired a cleaning service that included my apartment without checking if I wanted strangers in my space. She'd arranged for grocery delivery that included items I didn't want or need. She'd changed the timing of when garbage was collected from my apartment, making it less convenient for me to manage. Each decision had been presented as helpful, considerate, designed to make my life easier. But the cumulative effect had been to reduce my autonomy, to make me more dependent on her systems and schedules. I'd been so grateful for any consideration that I hadn't recognized the pattern of control underlying the apparent generosity. Now I wondered if the Christmas exclusion was simply the logical next step in a process that had been underway for months. If I was too sick to make decisions about garbage collection and grocery shopping, then surely I was too sick to make decisions about holiday participation. The realization made me angry in a way I hadn't been since Tom's death. I'd spent 2 years adapting to chronic illness, learning to manage my energy and symptoms while maintaining as much independence as possible. It had been a difficult process full of setbacks and adjustments, but I'd been proud of my ability to build a life that worked within my new limitations. Elena had been undermining that process, substituting her judgment for mine, using my condition as justification for increasingly controlling behavior. Whether she was conscious of the pattern or genuinely believed she was being helpful didn't matter. The effect was the same. My autonomy was being eroded one small decision at a time. Tomorrow, Martin's documents would arrive, and Elena would learn that the dependent she'd been managing was actually the benefactor she'd been taking for granted. I was curious to see how that knowledge would change her behavior, whether it would make her more respectful or simply more careful about how she expressed her desire for control. Either way, I was done accepting other people's assessments of my capabilities and worth. Sophie expected me at Christmas, and I intended to be there, regardless of whether Elena found my presence convenient. I had resources Elena didn't know about, and options she hadn't considered. It was time to remind her that generosity was a choice, not an obligation, and that choices could always be reconsidered. Friday morning brought an unexpected development that would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly timed. I was sipping coffee by my window when a courier van pulled into the driveway, followed almost immediately by Elena's car returning from the gym. She emerged from her vehicle looking polished and energetic in expensive workout clothes, her hair still perfectly styled despite whatever cardio routine she'd just completed. The courier met her at the front door with a thick manila envelope addressed to both Marcus and Elena Hartwell. I watched from above as Elena signed for the delivery, her expression curious but not concerned. She had no way of knowing that the envelope Martin's carefully prepared financial summary, the documentation that would transform her understanding of our family dynamics. What happened next was even more perfectly orchestrated than Martin could have planned. Elena opened the envelope right there on the front porch, probably expecting routine paperwork or holiday cards. I saw her face change as she read the first page, confusion giving way to surprise, then to something that looked like alarm. She flipped through the remaining pages quickly, her body language becoming increasingly tense. By the time she made it inside the house, she was moving with the rapid, agitated energy of someone who'd just received very unwelcome news. I settled back to wait, knowing that Marcus was still at work and wouldn't see the documents until evening. Elena would have all day to process the information, to figure out how to explain to her husband that they owed me considerably more money than either of them had been thinking about. My phone buzzed with a text message barely an hour later. "Pauline, could you come down when you have a moment? I'd like to discuss some paperwork we received." The tone was carefully neutral, but I could practically feel the tension radiating from the formal phrasing. Elena had never texted me about paperwork before. I took my time getting ready, choosing comfortable clothes, and making sure I had my own copies of all the financial documents in a folder I could reference if needed. I wasn't trying to be difficult, but I also wasn't going to rush to accommodate Elena's sudden desire for a conversation. She'd made me wait for weeks to understand where I stood in this family. She could wait an hour to understand where she stood financially. When I knocked on the kitchen door, Elena opened it immediately, suggesting she'd been watching for me. Her usual composure was intact, but there was something brittle around the edges, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was working harder than usual to maintain control. "Thank you for coming down," she said, gesturing for me to sit at the kitchen island where she'd spread out Martin's documents. "I have to admit, this paperwork caught me off guard. I was hoping you could help me understand what it all means." The performance was masterful. Elena had positioned herself as confused and seeking guidance, rather than confronted and defensive. She was treating the financial summary as if it were some mysterious communication that required translation, rather than a clear accounting of money she'd been spending without apparent thought. I settled onto the bar stool across from her and glanced at the papers. Martin had done excellent work. The summary was professional and thorough, laying out every financial contribution I'd made to their household over the past 3 years. The deferred loan payments were highlighted in yellow, the monthly trust contributions in blue, the estimated rental value of my apartment in green. Even someone with limited financial literacy could understand the implications. "It looks straightforward to me," I said mildly. "Your lawyer prepared an annual review of our financial arrangements. I asked him to send you copies, so we'd all be working from the same information." Elena's smile became more strained. "Your lawyer? I didn't realize you had ongoing legal representation." "I've used Martin Rodriguez for several years, since Tom died. He handles my estate planning and investment management." I paused, letting that sink in. "He suggested it might be helpful for everyone to have a clear picture of how our financial relationship has evolved." Evolved. Elena repeated, as if testing the word. Pauline, some of these numbers seem much larger than I expected. This summary suggests we owe you $75,000 in loan payments? That's correct. The original loan was $65,000, but the interest has been accumulating during the deferment period. Marcus asked for temporary relief from the payments when James was born, and I agreed to help out during the adjustment period. Elena flipped through the pages, her finger tracing numbers that were probably much larger than she'd been comfortable thinking about. And this trust fund for the children currently has over $100,000? $123,000 as of last month. I've been contributing monthly since Sophie was born, more since James arrived. I wanted to make sure their educational expenses would be covered regardless of what happened to Marcus's income or my health. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of construction from somewhere in the neighborhood. Elena stared at the papers as if they might change if she looked at them long enough. I could practically see her recalculating our family dynamics, reassessing conversations and decisions that probably looked very different in light of this new information. Pauline, she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, why are we seeing this now? Is there some problem with our arrangements that I'm not aware of? The question was a masterpiece of careful phrasing. Elena was asking if I was calling in debts or changing terms without actually admitting that she'd been thinking of me as financially insignificant. She was also positioning herself as surprised rather than caught, as if anyone in her situation would naturally lose track of owing someone $75,000. No immediate problem, I said, but Martin thought it would be wise to formalize some of our arrangements, especially given changes in my health situation. If something happened to me, Marcus would need clear documentation of our financial relationship for estate purposes. This was perfectly true, though not the whole truth. Elena didn't need to know that the changes in my health situation I was referring to had more to do with my family's perception of my capabilities than my actual medical condition. Elena nodded slowly, but I could see her mind working behind her eyes. She was smart enough to understand the subtext, to recognize that financial documentation rarely appeared out of nowhere without some triggering event. She just couldn't figure out what the trigger had been. Of course, she said. That makes perfect sense. I appreciate your attorney being so thorough. She paused, shuffling the papers into a neat stack. I should probably discuss this with Marcus when he gets home. Some of these arrangements were made before I was fully involved in our financial planning. The phrasing was diplomatic, but revealing. Elena was distancing herself from financial decisions that had been made jointly, setting up Marcus to take responsibility for debts she'd been happy to ignore when she thought they were insignificant. She was also implying that she'd been excluded from important conversations, which we both knew wasn't true. That sounds reasonable, I agreed. Martin mentioned that it might be helpful to set up a regular payment schedule for the loan, something manageable that works with your current budget. He said most people find it easier to plan when they know exactly what their obligations are. Elena's smile flickered. The suggestion of regular payments was perfectly reasonable, but it would also mean acknowledging the debt explicitly, rather than letting it exist in the comfortable gray area where it had been living. Monthly payments would be a constant reminder of their financial dependence, a regular challenge to the narrative of self-sufficiency they'd been maintaining. We'll definitely want to discuss that, she said, along with making sure we understand all the terms and implications. I stood to leave, gathering my purse and the folder I'd brought for reference. Of course. Martin said he's happy to answer any questions you might have. His contact information is on the letterhead. As I moved toward the door, Elena's voice stopped me. Pauline, I hope this doesn't change anything between us. I mean, family should be about more than financial arrangements, don't you think? The comment was beautifully crafted, positioning Elena as someone who valued relationships over money, while simultaneously suggesting that I might be the kind of person who would let financial considerations affect family harmony. She was trying to make me feel guilty for providing documentation of my generosity, as if transparency about money was somehow mercenary or inappropriate. I couldn't agree more, I said, turning back to face her. Family should definitely be about more than money. It should be about inclusion, consideration, and treating each other with respect regardless of who contributes what financially. Elena's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. She'd heard the message, understood that my concern wasn't really about loan payments or trust fund balances. This was about Christmas, about being told I was too sick to participate in my own family's celebration. Absolutely, she said. We all want what's best for the family. I left her with that thought, climbing the stairs to my apartment with a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. The conversation had gone exactly as Martin had predicted. Elena now understood the financial reality of their situation, but she hadn't been threatened or confronted directly. She'd been given information and invited to draw her own conclusions about what that information meant for how she treated me. The beauty of Martin's strategy was its complete deniability. If Elena chose to change her behavior, to reconsider my exclusion from Christmas, she could do so without admitting she'd been wrong or apologizing for her previous position. She could simply decide that including me would be better for family harmony, and everyone could maintain their dignity. If she didn't change her behavior, well, then I'd learned something important about her character and could make future decisions accordingly. I spent the afternoon writing Christmas cards to old friends and colleagues, people I'd lost touch with since my diagnosis but who'd been important parts of my life during my working years. It felt good to reconnect, to remind myself that I had an identity in relationships beyond my role as Marcus's mother and the children's grandmother. Several people wrote back immediately, warm messages about hoping to see me in the new year and invitations to coffee or lunch dates. Reading their responses, I realized how much I'd withdrawn from my own social life since moving into the apartment. I'd been so focused on being available for Marcus's family that I'd neglected the friendships and activities that had sustained me for decades. That evening, I could hear voices from the main house, Marcus and Elena discussing something in tones too low for me to distinguish words but intense enough to carry through the walls. Their conversation went on for nearly 2 hours, with periods of silence punctuated by bursts of rapid discussion. I imagined Elena explaining the financial documents, Marcus realizing how much money had been involved in arrangements he'd probably stopped thinking about consciously. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a strange mix of emotions I couldn't quite identify. "Elena told me about the paperwork you had sent over. I was wondering if we could talk." "Of course. Would you like to come up, or should I come down? Actually, could we take a walk? I need some air, and it might be easier to talk outside." We met at the bottom of my stairs, Marcus bundled in a heavy jacket against the December cold. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional car passing with Christmas music drifting from open windows. We walked slowly toward the park at the end of the street, neither of us speaking until we'd put some distance between ourselves and the house. "Mom," Marcus said finally, his breath visible in the cold air, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." The words surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness or justification, not immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "I never meant for our financial arrangements to become so lopsided," he continued. "When I asked for help with the house, and then when we needed to defer the loan payments, I thought about it as temporary. But temporary became normal, and normal became invisible. I stopped thinking about what we owed you because it was easier not to think about it." We reached the park and settled onto a bench under a streetlight decorated with a wreath. Marcus stared ahead at the empty playground, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. "Elena's been angry with me all evening," he said. "She says I never told her the full extent of our obligations to you, that she's been making decisions based on incomplete information. She's not wrong about that." I waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. But the truth is, I didn't want to think about it myself. It was easier to accept your help, without calculating what it all added up to. Easier to let Elena make decisions about your involvement in family activities without considering that maybe you deserved more consideration, not less. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and I felt my anger toward him soften. Marcus had always been sensitive to disappointment, prone to harsh self-judgment when he realized he'd fallen short of his own standards. As a child, he'd been more devastated by gentle correction than punishment, more motivated by the desire to make people proud than by any external consequence. Marcus, I said gently, I never wanted you to feel burdened by my help. I gave it freely because I love you and wanted to see you succeed. I know that. But accepting help freely doesn't mean I should take it for granted, or let other people make decisions about how you're treated because I'm uncomfortable with my own dependence. The insight was more mature than I'd expected from him, and it gave me hope that this conversation might lead to real change, rather than just temporary adjustment. Elena told me what she said about Christmas, he continued, about you being too sick to handle the family gathering. She says now that she was trying to protect you, but Mom, you should have been part of that conversation. We should have asked what you wanted instead of deciding what was best for you. I felt tears prick at my eyes, not from sadness but from relief. For weeks, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being oversensitive or unreasonable. Hearing Marcus acknowledge that I'd been excluded inappropriately validated feelings I'd been trying to suppress. I've been looking forward to Christmas morning for months, I said. I made a dollhouse for Sophie, blankets for James. I wanted to see their faces when they opened their presents. Marcus turned to look at me directly for the first time since we'd started walking. And you should see their faces. Elena's family can visit anytime, but this is Sophie and James's first Christmas with their grandmother living so close. We were idiots to think excluding you would somehow make the day better. The conversation was going better than I'd dared to hope, but I needed to address the larger pattern, not just the immediate crisis. Marcus, this isn't just about Christmas. Over the past year, Elena has been making more and more decisions that affect my daily life without consulting me. Small things mostly, but they add up to feeling like I don't have a voice in my own living situation. Marcus nodded slowly. She mentioned some of that tonight. The cleaning service, the grocery deliveries, changing collection schedules. She said she was trying to help, but I can see how it would feel controlling. I appreciated the intention, but I need to be asked before changes are made to my routine. I need to feel like my preferences matter, even about small things. They do matter. They should matter. And if we've been acting like they don't, that stops now. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a cat pick its way carefully across the frosty grass. The conversation had been easier than I'd expected, more honest than many we'd had in recent years. I wondered if the shock of seeing our financial relationship documented so clearly had forced Marcus to confront dynamics he'd been unconsciously avoiding. Mom, he said eventually, what do you need from us going forward? Not just for Christmas, but in general. How do we fix this? The question was direct and sincere, and I took time to consider my answer carefully. I didn't want to punish Marcus for Elena's behavior, but I also needed to establish boundaries that would prevent similar situations in the future. I need to be consulted about decisions that affect me, even when people think they know what's best for my health or convenience. I need to be included in family activities, unless I specifically ask to be excused. And I need Elena to understand that chronic illness doesn't make me incompetent or fragile. Marcus winced at the last point. She really doesn't understand your condition, does she? She keeps talking about boom and bust cycles and energy management like she read a few articles, and now she's an expert. Elena means well, but she's been using my diagnosis to justify decisions that are more about her comfort than my health. I'm not made of glass, Marcus. I know my own limitations better than anyone else does. I'll talk to her about that. About all of it. And Mom, about Christmas, Elena's already calling her family to adjust the plans. She wants to keep it smaller, more focused on the kids, and less on entertaining extended family. I felt a surge of satisfaction that I tried to keep from showing on my face. Elena was already adjusting her behavior based on the financial information, making changes that would allow her to include me without losing face. Martin's strategy was working exactly as he'd predicted. That sounds nice, I said neutrally. More intimate celebrations are often more meaningful anyway. We walked home slowly, both of us seeming reluctant to end a conversation that had cleared the air more than any we'd had in months. At the bottom of my stairs, Marcus hugged me tightly. the kind of full-contact embrace he'd given me as a child when he was feeling particularly affectionate. "I love you, Mom," he said, "and I'm sorry it took a financial wake-up call for me to pay attention to how we've been treating you." "I love you too. And Marcus, thank you for listening tonight. It means more than you know." After he went inside, I climbed to my apartment feeling cautiously optimistic. The conversation had gone better than I'd dared hope, but I knew that real change would depend on Elena's ability to adjust her behavior, not just her immediate response to financial pressure. The next morning brought confirmation that Elena was indeed capable of adaptation when properly motivated. I woke to find a handwritten note slipped under my door, written on Elena's expensive stationery in her careful script. "Pauline," it read, "I owe you an apology for the way I handled our conversation about Christmas. I was so focused on managing logistics that I forgot to consider your feelings and preferences. I've realized that excluding you was wrong, regardless of my intentions. I hope you'll join us for Christmas morning, and I promise to be more thoughtful about including you in family decisions going forward. We're lucky to have you so close, and I don't want to take that for granted. Elena." The note was perfectly crafted, acknowledging fault without making excuses, promising future changes without admitting to past malice. Elena had managed to apologize and reassert control at the same time, positioning herself as someone who'd made an honest mistake, rather than someone who'd been caught in inappropriate behavior. But the important thing was that she'd backed down. Christmas was back on the table, and she'd committed to including me in future decisions. Whether her change of heart was motivated by genuine remorse or financial calculation didn't matter as much as the practical outcome. I called Martin to update him on the developments, and he chuckled when I read Elena's note aloud. "Perfect," he said. "She's smart enough to recognize when her position has become untenable, and professional enough to retreat gracefully. You'll probably find that her behavior improves significantly now that she understands the full scope of your financial relationship. And if it doesn't, then we'll know that respect motivated by financial dependence isn't the same as genuine respect, and you can make decisions accordingly. But my guess is that Elena will be much more considerate going forward. People tend to treat their benefactors better than their dependents." The insight was cynical but probably accurate. Elena's apology might have been motivated by calculation rather than genuine remorse, but the practical effect would be the same. I would be included in Christmas, consulted about future decisions, treated with the consideration I deserved as a contributing member of the household. I spent the rest of the morning wrapping presents and preparing for what I hoped would be a genuinely happy holiday. The dollhouse looked even more impressive with silver ribbon and a large bow, and I'd added a few extra accessories I'd been saving for Sophie's birthday. James's blankets were soft and warm, knitted in the blues and greens Elena had used to decorate his nursery. Around noon, Sophie appeared at my door with her arms full of construction paper and glitter, her face bright with excitement. "Grandma Pauline, I'm making Christmas cards for everyone, and I need to make one for you. What's your favorite color?" "Purple," I said, opening the door wider to invite her in. "But I love all colors when they're in your artwork." She settled at my kitchen table with her supplies, chattering about her plans for the card while she worked. As I watched her concentrate on cutting out paper stars, I felt a deep sense of rightness that had been missing for weeks. This was what Christmas should be about. Time with people you loved, shared joy in simple pleasures, the kind of connection that money couldn't buy, but financial security could protect. Elena had made a serious error in judgment, but she'd also shown that she was capable of course correction when presented with new information. That flexibility, even if motivated by self-interest, suggested that our relationship might be salvageable after all. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in weeks, I was genuinely looking forward to the holiday. I had my place at the family table back, my financial contribution had been acknowledged, and my granddaughter was making me a card with purple glitter stars. Elena thought she'd been protecting her family from my inconvenient illness, but she'd actually been risking their financial stability and Sophie's relationship with her grandmother. The miscalculation had been costly, but hopefully it had also been educational. I was curious to see how Christmas morning would unfold, whether Elena's newfound consideration would feel genuine or performative. Either way, I'd be there to watch my grandchildren open their presents, to participate in the tradition I'd shared with Marcus for over 3 decades. And if Elena ever forgot again, who was really supporting their comfortable lifestyle, well, Martin had taught me that financial power was most effective when it was visible but not explicitly threatened. Elena now knew exactly how much my continued generosity was worth, and that knowledge would inform every interaction we had going forward. Sometimes the best revenge was simply making sure people understood the true cost of their behavior. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow falling softly outside my window, the kind of picturesque winter scene that belonged on greeting cards. I woke early, filled with an anticipation I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Elena's initial exclusion, I was genuinely excited about the holiday instead of dreading it. The main house showed signs of frantic preparation. I could see Elena moving efficiently through the kitchen, her usual precision amplified by what I suspected was nervous energy. She'd spent the past 2 days restructuring her elaborate family gathering, explaining to her relatives that they'd decided to keep Christmas more intimate this year. Her parents' and sister's family were still coming, but they'd arranged to stay at a nearby hotel rather than crowding into the house, and the formal dinner had been moved to the day after Christmas. The changes allowed Elena to include me without admitting she'd been wrong to exclude me initially. She could present the modifications as thoughtful family planning rather than damage control, maintaining her dignity while accommodating the new reality of our relationship. Around 10 in the morning, Sophie burst through my door carrying a plate of cookies still warm from the oven. "Grandma Pauline, Mommy made sugar cookies, and she said I could bring you some before Daddy ate them all." The cookies were perfect, decorated with royal icing in festive colors and shapes. Elena had always been an excellent baker, the kind of person who made elaborate treats look effortless. I appreciated that she'd thought to send some up, a small gesture that suggested she was making an effort to repair our relationship. "These are beautiful, Sophie. Did you help decorate them?" "I did the snowman ones. See how his carrot nose is a little crooked? Mommy said, that makes him have character." Sophie beamed with pride as she pointed out her contributions, unaware that her imperfect decorations were actually my favorites on the plate. "Character is much more interesting than perfection," I agreed, thinking about how the observation applied to more than just cookie decorating. Sophie climbed into the chair across from me, her legs swinging as she nibbled on a star-shaped cookie. "Grandma Pauline, are you excited about tomorrow? I can hardly sleep because I keep thinking about presents." "I'm very excited, especially about watching you and James open your gifts. That's always my favorite part of Christmas morning." "Mine too. Well, that and the presents themselves." Sophie giggled at her own honesty. "Mommy says you made something special for me, but she won't tell me what it is." The dollhouse was hidden in my bedroom closet, wrapped in silver paper with an enormous bow. I'd spent the morning adding final touches, tiny throw pillows for the miniature furniture, and battery-operated lights for the little chandelier. Despite the cramping in my hands that had made the detailed work challenging, I was proud of what I'd created. "I hope you'll like it," I said. "It's something I've been working on for a long time." We spent a pleasant hour together, Sophie chattering about school and friends while I listened and asked questions. These were the moments I'd been most afraid of losing. The simple pleasure of being someone's favorite audience, of having unlimited time to focus on a child's enthusiastic stories. Elena appeared at my door around noon, looking polished but slightly harried. She'd clearly made an effort with her appearance, wearing a festive red sweater and the pearl necklace Marcus had given her for their anniversary. Her smile seemed more genuine than it had in recent weeks, though I detected an underlying nervousness in her demeanor. "Pauline, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, glancing at Sophie, who was now sprawled on my floor working on a coloring book. "I wanted to check what time would work best for you to join us tomorrow morning. The kids usually wake up around 7, but we could wait until you're ready." The question was considerate, acknowledging that my energy levels varied and that I might need flexibility in timing. It was exactly the kind of consultation I'd been hoping for, a recognition that including me meant accommodating my needs, rather than expecting me to adapt to predetermined schedules. 7 sounds perfect, I said. I'm usually an early riser anyway, and I wouldn't want to keep the children waiting when they're excited about presents. Elena's relief was visible. Wonderful. We'll do presents first, then breakfast whenever everyone's ready. Very casual and relaxed. That sounds lovely. Is there anything I can contribute? I could make my cranberry bread or help with breakfast preparations. Oh, that's so thoughtful, but please don't worry about cooking. Just focus on enjoying the morning. Elena paused, then added, though if you're feeling up to it later in the day, I'd love the company while I prepare dinner. I always enjoy our conversations when we're cooking together. The invitation surprised me. Elena and I had cooked together occasionally, but she'd never specifically requested my company before. The gesture felt like an attempt to rebuild our relationship on more equal footing, to move beyond the recent tension towards something more collaborative. I'd like that, I said. As long as you promise to let me know if I'm getting in the way. You never get in the way, Elena said, and for the first time in months, her words felt completely sincere. After she left with Sophie, I spent the afternoon putting finishing touches on my preparations. I wrapped the remaining gifts, including small presents for Elena's parents and sister's family. I'd been planning to give these before the exclusion, and I saw no reason to withdraw the gesture now that I was included again. The evening was quiet, filled with the kind of anticipatory calm that preceded important occasions. I could hear normal family sounds from the main house, bath time for the children, the television playing Christmas specials, Marcus and Elena discussing logistics in low voices. The sounds were familiar and comforting, reminders of the family life I'd been temporarily excluded from. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus appeared at my door carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that was both sheepish and determined. Mom, do you have a few minutes? I brought a peace offering. He held up the bottle, a vintage red that I recognized as expensive. Of course, come in. We settled in my small living room, Marcus pouring wine into the good glasses I saved for special occasions. He seemed more relaxed than he had during our conversation in the park, less burdened by guilt and more focused on moving forward. I wanted to thank you, he said, for handling this situation with so much grace. Elena told me about your conversation yesterday, how considerate you were even though you had every right to be angry. I sipped the wine, which was indeed excellent, and considered how to respond. I was angry, Marcus. But I was also hurt. And hurt is usually more productive to address than anger. Elena's been doing a lot of thinking since she saw those financial documents. She said she realized she'd been making assumptions about your role in our family that weren't fair or accurate. What kind of assumptions? Marcus looked uncomfortable, but he answered honestly. That you were the one receiving help rather than giving it. That your illness made you dependent on us, rather than us being dependent on you. She said she'd gotten the power dynamic completely backwards. The admission was more direct than I'd expected, and I appreciated Marcus's willingness to articulate what had been happening explicitly, rather than dancing around it diplomatically. It's easy to make those assumptions when the help someone provides is quiet and consistent, I said. I've never wanted credit or recognition for my contributions. But I also didn't expect them to be forgotten or dismissed. They won't be again. Elena's already talking about setting up automatic payments for the loan, making our financial relationship more formal and accountable. She said she never wants to be in a position again where she takes your generosity for granted. This was exactly what Martin had predicted. Elena was smart enough to understand that formal financial arrangements would protect everyone involved, preventing future misunderstandings and ensuring that my contributions were acknowledged systematically rather than sporadically. That sounds sensible, I agreed. Clarity about money usually makes family relationships easier, not harder. Marcus nodded, swirling his wine thoughtfully. Mom, can I ask you something personal? When you decided to have your lawyer send those documents, were you trying to teach us a lesson, or were you genuinely concerned about estate planning? The question was perceptive, and I respected him for asking it directly, rather than pretending not to notice the timing of Martin's communication. Both, I said honestly. I was hurt about Christmas, and I wanted you to understand the full context of our relationship. But I was also concerned about what would happen to you financially if something happened to me, and our arrangements weren't properly documented. Fair enough, and effective. Elena spent 2 days recalculating our budget and realizing how much we've been depending on your support without acknowledging it. We finished the wine in comfortable conversation, discussing Christmas plans and catching up on family news I'd missed during the weeks of tension. When Marcus left, he hugged me warmly and whispered, "I'm glad you'll be with us tomorrow, Mom. It wouldn't be Christmas without you." Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the fresh snow sparkling in the early sunlight. I dressed carefully in a festive green dress, and the jewelry Tom had given me over the years, wanting to look my best for what I hoped would be a healing family celebration. At exactly 7 o'clock, I knocked on the kitchen door carrying my contributions to the morning, the wrapped presents, and a thermos of the special hot chocolate I made with real cream and Belgian chocolate. Sophie's delighted squeals were already audible from the living room, where she'd apparently discovered that Santa had indeed found their house. Elena opened the door with a genuine smile, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. She was wearing Christmas pajamas that matched Sophie's, her hair in a casual ponytail, her face free of the careful makeup she usually wore for family gatherings. "Merry Christmas, Pauline," she said, pulling me into a quick hug. "Perfect timing. Sophie's been asking for you every 5 minutes since she woke up." The living room was a chaos of Christmas morning energy. Sophie was bouncing between presents, trying to examine everything at once, while James sat in his high chair banging a wooden spoon against the tray with intense concentration. Marcus was on the floor attempting to organize gifts into manageable piles, his hair sticking up from sleep. "Grandma Pauline!" Sophie launched herself at me with the force of a small missile, wrapping her arms around my waist. "You're here!" "I was worried you might be too tired." "But you're here." The comment was innocent, but it revealed how much of the adult tension Sophie had absorbed, despite Elena's efforts to shield her. My granddaughter had been prepared for my absence, taught to expect less from our relationship, and her relief at my presence was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. "I wouldn't miss Christmas morning with you," I said, smoothing her hair. "Not for anything in the world." The present opening proceeded with the joyful chaos typical of Christmas mornings with small children. Sophie approached each gift with theatrical appreciation, examining the wrapping paper and bows as carefully as the contents. James was more interested in the paper itself, which he attempted to eat with single-minded determination. When Sophie unwrapped the dollhouse, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for, and more. She gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth in genuine amazement. "Grandma Pauline, did you make this? It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The dollhouse was a Victorian mansion, complete with turrets and gingerbread trim, furnished with tiny beds and chairs and tables I'd crafted by hand. The working lights cast a warm glow through miniature windows, and I'd included a family of small dolls dressed in period costumes. Sophie spent the next 20 minutes exploring every room, discovering hidden details and marveling at the miniature accessories. Her joy was infectious, drawing everyone into her excitement as she explained the story she was already creating about the doll family who lived in the house. Elena watched Sophie's reaction with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between appreciation and regret. When Sophie finally looked up from her exploration, Elena said softly, "Sophie, do you know how long Grandma Pauline worked on that for you?" "How long?" Sophie asked, still clutching one of the tiny dolls. "Months and months. She made every piece of furniture by hand, even when her fingers hurt from her illness. She wanted to create something perfect just for you." I was surprised by Elena's willingness to acknowledge my illness in positive terms, to frame it as something I'd overcome, rather than something that limited me. The comment felt like a small but significant shift in how she understood my condition and capabilities. "Thank you, Grandma Pauline," Sophie said solemnly. "I'll take extra special care of it forever and ever." James's gifts were a success as well, though his appreciation was expressed more through enthusiastic drooling than words. The blankets I'd knitted were soft and warm, and Elena immediately wrapped one around him, commenting on the perfect weight and texture. "Pauline, these are museum quality," she said, examining the intricate cable pattern. "I had no idea you were such an accomplished knitter." "I learned from my mother, and I've had plenty of time to practice lately. It's good therapy for my hands, actually." The repetitive motion helps with the stiffness. Again, Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if filing away information about how I managed my condition that she hadn't considered before. The conversation felt like the beginning of a more realistic understanding between us, based on actual knowledge rather than assumptions. The morning continued with breakfast and more relaxed gift opening. Elena's parents and sister arrived around 10, bringing their own contributions to the celebration. They were warm and welcoming to me, including me naturally in conversations and activities without the awkward tiptoeing I'd sometimes experienced from people who weren't sure how to interact with someone with chronic illness. I found myself wondering what Elena had told them about the change in plans. Whether she'd explained my inclusion as a last-minute addition, or presented it as always having been the plan. Either way, they treated me as an integral part of the family gathering, asking about my health with genuine concern, but not making it the focus of every interaction. Around noon, Elena and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen preparing lunch while the rest of the family played with Sophie's new toys in the living room. We worked together comfortably, falling into the rhythm we'd established during previous cooking collaborations. "Pauline," Elena said as she sliced vegetables for salad, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation." I continued stirring the soup I was heating, giving her space to say whatever she needed to say without pressure or judgment. "When Marcus first suggested you move into the apartment, I was genuinely excited about having you close. I thought it would be wonderful for the children, and helpful for you after Tom died. But somewhere along the way, I started seeing your needs as problems to solve rather than normal parts of family life." She paused, setting down her knife and turning to face me directly. "I think I was scared that taking care of you would become my responsibility. That Marcus would expect me to manage your illness the way wives traditionally manage family caregiving. And instead of talking about those fears or asking what you actually needed, I started trying to control situations to minimize what I saw as potential burdens." The explanation was more honest than I'd expected, and it helped me understand Elena's behavior in ways that made it less personal and more forgivable. She hadn't been malicious, just frightened and inexperienced with chronic illness in the family. "Elena, I never expected you to take care of me. I moved here to be close to family, not to become anyone's obligation. I know that now, but at the time, all I could see was how much help Marcus's grandmother had needed in her final years. How exhausted his mother became trying to manage her care. I was terrified of ending up in that situation, especially with 2 small children to raise. Marcus's grandmother had indeed required extensive care before her death, though that had been due to dementia rather than chronic fatigue syndrome. Elena had apparently been extrapolating from that experience without understanding the significant differences between the conditions. "My illness isn't progressive the way dementia is," I said gently. "I have good days and bad days, but I'm not going to deteriorate steadily or lose my ability to make decisions about my own care. I'm starting to understand that. I've been reading more about chronic fatigue syndrome, actual medical sources instead of random internet articles. I realize I had a lot of misconceptions about what your condition actually means for your daily life." We continued cooking in companionable silence, the tension between us easing into something that felt more sustainable. When lunch was ready, we called everyone to the table for a meal that felt genuinely celebratory rather than performatively polite. During dessert, Sophie made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I have something to say," she declared, standing up in her chair with the authority of someone much older. "I want to thank Grandma Pauline for coming to Christmas, even though she was tired. And I want to thank Mommy for changing her mind about Grandma being too sick. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but they can fix them if they try hard enough." The room fell silent except for James, babbling contentedly in his high chair. Elena's face flushed slightly, but she smiled at Sophie with genuine appreciation for her daughter's wisdom. "You're absolutely right, Sophie," Elena said. "Sometimes grown-ups do make mistakes, and sometimes we need little girls to remind us what's really important." Marcus raised his wineglass in a mock toast. "To Sophie, the wisest person at this table, and to second chances." The afternoon passed peacefully, with extended family departing for their hotel, and the immediate family settling into the comfortable lethargy that followed big holiday meals. I helped Elena with dishes, we played board games with Sophie, and I held James while he napped in my arms. Around 5 o'clock, as I was preparing to return to my apartment for some rest, Elena stopped me at the door. "Pauline, I want you to know that Marcus and I talked last night about making some changes going forward. Not just about including you in family activities, but about consulting you on decisions that affect your living situation. We'd like to set up a monthly family meeting where we can discuss schedules, plans, any issues that come up." The suggestion was practical and respectful, a way to ensure that communication happened regularly rather than only during crises. "That sounds very reasonable," I said. "I'd appreciate being kept in the loop about things that affect me. And we're going to formalize the loan repayment schedule, like Marcus mentioned. I want there to be no question about our financial obligations or your contributions to this household." Elena's voice carried a note of determination that suggested she was serious about changing the dynamic between us. Whether motivated by guilt, financial reality, or genuine understanding, she seemed committed to treating me as an equal partner in family decisions, rather than a dependent to be managed. "I think that will be better for everyone," I agreed. "Clarity about money usually prevents problems rather than creating them." As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed in just a few days. Christmas morning had been everything I'd hoped for, filled with genuine joy and connection, rather than the polite tolerance I'd feared. Elena's apology had felt sincere, her explanations helpful, rather than defensive. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed my place in the family without having to sacrifice my dignity or accept treatment that diminished my worth. The financial documentation had provided leverage, but the real victory was being seen clearly by people who'd been viewing me through the distorting lens of their own anxieties and assumptions. That evening, I called Martin to update him on the day's events and thank him for his strategic guidance. "It sounds like Elena is capable of learning when properly motivated," he said with amusement. The combination of financial reality and Christmas guilt probably created the perfect storm for attitude adjustment. "Do you think the changes will stick, or is this just temporary face-saving?" "Time will tell, but my guess is that Elena's smart enough to recognize that treating you well is in her own best interest. She's seen what happens when she miscalculates your importance to the family, and she's unlikely to make the same mistake twice." Martin was probably right. Elena had learned that I wasn't the powerless dependent she'd imagined, and that knowledge would inform all our future interactions. She might not love having to accommodate my needs and preferences, but she'd understand that accommodation was preferable to the alternatives. The next few days passed quietly, with Elena's extended family visiting during the day, but everyone maintaining the more relaxed dynamic we'd established on Christmas morning. Elena made a point of including me in activities and conversations, asking my opinion on plans and checking whether timing worked for my energy levels. The changes felt genuine rather than performative, as if she'd internalized new assumptions about our relationship rather than simply adjusting her behavior temporarily. When her parents expressed surprise at how well I looked despite my illness, Elena spoke knowledgeably about chronic fatigue syndrome and the importance of not making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their medical conditions. On New Year's Eve, as I watched fireworks from my apartment window, I reflected on how much had changed since Elena's initial declaration that I was too sick for Christmas. I'd learned things about myself that I might never have discovered otherwise, that I had more power than I'd realized, that respect sometimes had to be demanded rather than simply earned, and that family love could be conditional, even when no one wanted to admit it. Elena had learned that generosity could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, that financial dependence created obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely, and that excluding people from family celebrations carried costs she hadn't anticipated. Marcus had learned that accepting help without acknowledgement was a form of entitlement, that his mother's illness didn't make her incompetent, and that protecting his wife's preferences sometimes meant failing to protect his mother's dignity. Most importantly, we'd all learned that family relationships required ongoing negotiation and mutual respect, not just love and good intentions. Christmas had been saved, but more than that, our family dynamic had been fundamentally recalibrated in ways that would serve us all better going forward. 3 months later, the monthly family meetings Elena had proposed were working well, providing structure for discussions about schedules, finances, and household decisions. The loan repayment plan was in place and being followed consistently. Elena consulted me about changes to shared spaces and included me in social planning without making my participation feel like charity. I'd also made changes in my own life, reconnecting with old friends and pursuing interests I'd neglected since my diagnosis. Having my place in Marcus's family secured and acknowledged had given me the confidence to expand my social world rather than shrinking it around my illness. The dollhouse remained Sophie's favorite possession, and she often invited me to join her elaborate storytelling games about the family who lived there. During one of these sessions, she looked up at me with the serious expression she wore when working through important concepts. "Grandma Pauline," she said, "do you think the mommy doll in the house ever gets tired of taking care of everyone?" The question was innocent but perceptive, suggesting that Sophie had absorbed more of the adult dynamics than anyone had realized. "I think all mommies get tired sometimes," I said carefully. "But I also think the best mommies figure out how to ask for help when they need it, instead of trying to do everything by themselves." Sophie nodded solemnly, then repositioned the dolls so the grandma doll was helping the mommy doll cook dinner in the tiny kitchen. "Like this," she said with satisfaction. "Everyone helps everyone, and nobody has to do everything alone." Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. My 6-year-old granddaughter had articulated the lesson it had taken the adults in our family months of conflict to learn. Family worked best when everyone contributed according to their abilities, and everyone was valued for their contributions. Elena had thought she could exclude me because I was too sick to be worth the trouble of inclusion. She discovered instead that I was too valuable to exclude, that my contributions to their family's stability and happiness went far beyond what she'd bothered to notice or acknowledge. The trust fund Martin had mentioned still existed, still held nearly $3 million that would eventually benefit Marcus and the children. But now Elena knew it existed, understood that my continued generosity was a choice rather than an obligation, and treated me accordingly. I'd gotten my Christmas back, along with my dignity and my place at the family table. But more than that, I'd gotten the respect that should have been mine all along, and the assurance that it wouldn't be withdrawn the next time someone found my needs inconvenient. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the willingness to demand the treatment you deserve, regardless of who finds that demand uncomfortable. Elena had learned that lesson the hard way, but she'd learned it thoroughly. And every time I watched Sophie playing with her dollhouse, carefully arranging the tiny family in scenes of mutual care and cooperation, I was reminded that the most important battles are often fought not for ourselves but for the example we set for the people who come after us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.